John 6:58. Hic est panis qui de caelo descendit, non sicut manducaverunt patres vestri manna, et mortui sunt, qui manducat hunc panem vivet in aeternum. This is the bread which has come down from heaven, not like the bread we have to supply, the manna, which your fathers ate and they died. He who feeds on this bread will live forever. Here Jesus is continuing his discourse about the bread of life, and he's drawing a major contrast between the experience of the fathers of those in the audience to whom he's speaking. That is the ancient Hebrews who were wandering in the desert of Sinai on their way to the promised land, eating manna. And he's contrasting that experience with those, in this case, an individual imagined person, he who is feeding on or eating this bread, the bread that he's talking about, the bread of life. So that's going to frame our whole understanding of this verse. Now, one of the things that might be a bit confusing to you about it is the lack of punctuation. This is always a problem when we're talking about ancient texts into which our modern punctuation has to be anachronistically imported to make us feel more comfortable. Again, things were done differently in the ancient world. But for our purposes, what shall we say? Perhaps something like a comma here, and perhaps like a semicolon here. That, again, this is sort of cheating in a historical sense, but I think it's okay to do as you read Latin sentences, because the first thing you should do when you read a verse in the Vulgate, or indeed any Latin sentence, is read it over first, ideally aloud. That's what I tell my students anyway, because hearing yourself read it and reading it with your eyes, that's two different ways of experiencing the text at the same time. And the more ways that you can experience Latin at one time, the more quickly your learning will proceed and the more deeply it will sink into your brain. But you should read a sentence all the way through for the first time, and again aloud, before you really begin to try to understand it or figure it out. And what you should try to do is don't try and translate as you're reading for the first time. And this is what I do, by the way. I'm not telling you to do anything that I don't practice myself. Try to get a sense as you're reading through that verse for the first time of its structure. Are there parallel clauses? Is there something like a not only but also structure? Is it structured by a series of participles? Where are the finite verbs? Like, just try to sort of passively notice how the thing is put together. Now, that's a bit of a challenge in the case of this sentence, as I've sort of mentioned, because it seems like a run-on sentence by modern English standards, and that's why we're adding in the punctuation here. And you don't have to add in punctuation in a written form when you're reading a Latin text, of course, but perhaps you can do it in your mind sometimes, because that's just another way, I think, of getting accustomed to the way that Latin sentences can be built and structured, which again is going to be a little bit different from what we're used to in English. So I'm just making that process explicit by marking the punctuation in there. I'm sorry if that offends any purists among us, but I think it's helpful. I think it's helpful as a kind of trellis or scaffolding that we can benefit from until this process becomes automatic as we experience more Latin. Okay, so let's look at this verse here. Hic est panis. We've seen this word many times. This is the bread which has descended, has come down. Now, how do we know that this has come down? What, for instance, would be the present tense of this verb? So this is from descendo, descendere, third conjugation verb. Wouldn't the present tense also be descendit? It sure would. So how can we tell the difference in a particular case? How can we know whether this is the third person singular, present active indicative, or the third person singular, perfect active indicative? After all, we form the perfect system off of this element right here, descendi. I went down. Well, in this case, we can always cheat on one level if we're not sure from context by taking a quick look at the Greek text. And in fact, in the Greek text, we have an aorist participle, which tells us there's no way that would have escaped the attention of our very careful Latin translator here, who's watching the Greek text like a hawk. So what we've got is, this is the bread which has come down or came down from heaven, de kailo, a phrase we've seen many, many times. Non sicut, and this is really the main structuring bit here that lets us into the secret, as it were, of this whole sentence. Not as, so we've got a comparison, not just like, rather in a different way from, patres vestri, your fathers, your ancestors here. Patres can indicate more than just literal father. It can mean ancestors, predecessors. Depending on the context, you have to make that decision. It's not as your, y'alls in Southern American English, colloquial English, not just as y'all's fathers fed on manna, and this is an indeclinable loan word from Hebrew. Another thing we need to note about it is it's not present in some of the Greek manuscripts. Many of the Greek manuscripts just say, not as your fathers ate. Presumably, we could supply something like in the desert when they were wandering and died. But in some Greek manuscripts, we find manna, just to fill out the sense here, and the Vulgate follows that particular group of manuscripts. That's why maybe you didn't notice this word or didn't remember it if you looked at the daily dose of Greek for this verse, for instance. The next thing we need to talk about is mortuisunt. This is a compound verb form from the Latin verb morior, third conjugation verb, and also, very importantly, a deponent verb. So this isn't what you might be tempted to think it is. It's not an adjective plus a present tense form of esse. In fact, it's a compound, third person plural, perfect in form, passive indicative. But of course, in meaning, we've got an active, perfect indicative here. They died. And remember, when you've got these compound verb forms, you've got to make sure that they match in number and gender the subject, which here again is patres vestri. Finally, this last bit poses no problems for us. We don't need to supply is here, but just to make the meaning clear, he who, which you can say just with qui by itself in Latin, he who feeds on this bread that I've been talking about, by contrast, he will, don't forget that future tense there, he will live forever.